The land had always been quiet. Long before sunrise, the cornfield would sit under a soft layer of mist, the rows stretching out like calm lines waiting for the day to begin. The farmer had walked this land for most of his adult life. Every season followed a rhythm he knew by heart. Planting in the spring, watching the tall green stalks rise in summer, harvesting when the air turned crisp. It wasn't just work. It was routine, memory, and peace all rolled into one. He didn't own the land because he was rich or powerful. He owned it because years ago he took a risk, worked long days, and slowly built something stable. The cornfield paid the bills, but more than that, it gave him a sense of control in a world that often felt unpredictable. Out here, things made sense. You planted seeds. You cared for them. You waited. And if you did things right, the land rewarded you. The neighbors had always been easy. Most people in the area kept to themselves. They waved when passing by, sometimes stopped to chat about the weather or the price of grain, but nobody crossed lines. Boundaries were clear, both on paper and in respect. That was how it had always been, that peace changed the morning the new. Neighbors showed up. She arrived in a shiny SUV that looked out of place on the dirt road. It slowed near the edge of the field, tires crunching on gravel, then stopped. The farmer noticed her because strangers were rare, especially ones dressed like they were headed to a meeting instead of a muddy field. She stepped out, phone in hand, scanning the area as if she already owned it. At first, he thought she might be lost. He walked over, wiping his hands on his jeans, ready to point her back toward the main road. Before he could speak, she raised her chin and said she was the new property owner next door. Her voice was firm, confident, and loud enough to carry across the field. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask questions. Instead, she pointed toward the edge of the cornfield and said part of it was on her land. The words didn't make sense. The farmer blinked, then laughed a little, thinking she must be joking. That strip of land had always been his. He had planted it every year. His fence line had been there longer than most people in town could remember. He told her calmly that she must be mistaken. Her smile faded. She said she had paperwork. She said her real estate agent had confirmed it. She said the previous owners had encroached and nobody had bothered to fix it. She spoke fast, using big words, like she had practiced this conversation before. The farmer listened, arms crossed, trying to stay polite. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply said that his deed showed otherwise. He even offered to show her the boundary markers that had been there for decades. She shook her head. She said she didn't need to see them. That was the first red flag. Before leaving, she stepped closer to the field, took several photos, and said she would be handling this properly. The way she said it made his stomach tighten. Then she got back into her SUV and drove off, leaving behind tire tracks and an uneasy silence. For the rest of the day, the farmer tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation. People didn't usually show up making claims like that unless they believed them or planned to force them. Either way, it spelled trouble. A few days passed without incident, and he started to think maybe it would blow over. One morning, while checking the edge of the field, he noticed bright orange stakes hammered into the ground. They ran in a crooked line straight through the corn. Attached to some of them were small flags fluttering in the wind. He stood there, staring, his heart pounding. Those stakes weren't his. He followed the line, counting rows in his head, knowing exactly how much land they cut through. It wasn't a small strip. It was enough to hurt the harvest if left alone. Enough to send a clear message. Later that day, she showed up again. This time, she didn't smile at all. She told him she was marking her property. She said he needed to stop farming that section immediately. She warned him that continuing would be considered trespassing. Trespassing. The word hung heavy in the air. He felt anger rise, but he kept his voice steady. He told her again that the land was his, and that he wouldn't stop working it based on her say-so. He asked her to remove the stakes until things were sorted out properly. She crossed her arms and said no. She said she had already contacted the county office. She said inspectors would be coming. She said she hoped he understood how serious this was. Then she left. Once again, without waiting for a response, that night sleep didn't come easily. The farmer lay awake thinking about worst-case scenarios. Missed planting. Legal fees. Lost income. The land had always been a source of calm, but now it felt like a battlefield. Over the next week, the situation escalated. He heard from a neighbor that she had been telling people the farmer was stealing land. Someone else mentioned she planned to build a fence. Another said she bragged about finally putting an end to rural ignorance. The words stung more than he expected. He had worked this land honestly. Every inch of it mattered. Being painted as a thief, even quietly, felt like an attack on his character. One afternoon, a county vehicle pulled up near the road. An official stepped out, clipboard in hand, and began walking the boundary. The farmer followed, answering questions, pointing out markers, explaining the history. The official listened, but didn't give much away. When the official left, there were no answers, only uncertainty. That evening, standing at the edge of the cornfield as the sun dipped low, the farmer made a quiet decision. He wasn't going to shout. He wasn't going to threaten. And he wasn't going to give up. If she wanted to play this game, he would play it the right way. He looked out over the rows of corn, the same rows he had planted with his own hands, and felt something solid settle in his chest. This land had stories written into the soil. It wasn't going to be taken by confidence and paperwork, waved around like a weapon. What she didn't know yet was that the farmer had patience. And patience, when paired with truth, could change everything. This was only the beginning. The next morning started like any other, the soft light spilling across the cornfield. But the peace of the early hours had vanished. The farmer could feel it the moment he stepped outside. The orange stakes she had left days before were now more numerous, scattered in ways that made it clear she was not going away quietly. He counted them again, row by row, feeling the weight of her confidence pressing down on him. He decided to finish his chores first. Feeding the livestock, checking irrigation lines, inspecting the crops. His movements were precise and practiced, but his mind kept drifting back to her claim. Every sound from the nearby road made him tense. Every passerby seemed to carry a hidden message. He knew Karen was clever, and he knew she had been telling others about her supposed victory, the rumor spreading faster than any official paperwork could travel. By midday, she arrived again. This time, there was a small crowd with her friends, neighbors, people from the town who had never spoken to the farmer before. She drove slowly along the edge of the field, making sure he could see her. She gestured at the stakes and said loudly that she had every right to protect her property. The crowd murmured in agreement, though the farmer knew most of them had no idea what they were talking about. They had only heard her version of the story. He stepped out from the corn, hands on his hips, and addressed them calmly. He explained that the land had been in his care for years, that the boundary lines were well established, and that the stakes were misleading. His words fell into the wind, but some curious ears caught them. A few neighbors paused, uncertain, but she quickly filled the silence with her own confident version of events. It was clear she thrived on attention and spectacle. That evening, as the sun started to set, the farmer sat on the porch looking over the rows of corn. He could see the stakes glinting orange in the fading light, a stubborn reminder that the conflict was only beginning. He made a plan. He would not engage in shouting matches or public arguments. He would gather information, talk to the right people, and document everything. Karen was playing a game, but he intended to play it smarter. Over the next few days, her tactics escalated. She began leaving notes on his gate, letters full of legal jargon and warnings. She called the local county office repeatedly, claiming she needed urgent inspections. She even brought in a surveyor, though the farmer suspected this was more intimidation than accuracy. The surveyor spent a short time looking at stakes and maps, nodding politely, but said nothing definitive. Karen waved it around like a weapon anyway, showing others she was taking action. The farmer didn't respond to each provocation immediately. He continued his work, documented every visit, every note, every photograph. His phone was busy with calls from neighbors asking questions. Some wanted to support him. Others simply wanted to know what was true. The lines between truth and rumor blurred quickly, and he realized the fight was no longer just about the cornfield, it was about perception. One afternoon, while inspecting the edge of the field, he noticed tire marks not from Karen's vehicle. Someone had driven through the mud near the stakes, disturbing the soil and flattening a few young corn plants. He took photographs immediately. Whoever it was a clear message that others were watching and maybe being emboldened by her claims. The farmer knew that even small acts like this could be used to reinforce our narrative, so he recorded everything meticulously. He also began speaking to older residents in town, people who had lived there for decades. They remembered previous owners, previous boundary lines, and even old disputes that had been resolved long before Karen arrived. Their memories were precise, and in talking to them, he found reassurance. His story had roots deeper than her sudden claims. Despite the stress, he remained calm in public. He didn't confront Karen directly when she tried to provoke him in front of others. Instead, he let her display confidence while he prepared evidence. He realized she relied on spectacle and intimidation. If he stayed calm, documented facts, and allowed the truth to surface, her theatrics would eventually falter, but the pressure kept mounting. Karen began spreading more aggressive claims, suggesting he was knowingly trespassing. Some of her friends questioned whether he could continue farming safely. Supplies were delivered late. A few small disagreements arose with local vendors who had been influenced by her statements. The farmer felt the weight of the conflict, yet he focused on what he could control: the land, the crops, and the meticulous gathering of proof. One morning, an unexpected ally appeared. A longtime neighbor, a quiet man who had been a farmer himself, came over with copies of old maps, deeds, and survey notes. Together, they compared the old records to Karen's claims. It was painstaking work, but slowly, a pattern emerged. Her claims didn't match the historical boundaries. The stakes she had planted were not aligned with the official lines. She had misunderstood, or worse, intentionally misrepresented them. The farmer felt a mixture of relief and caution. The evidence was strong, but Karen's persistence meant the fight was far from over. He began drafting letters, taking photographs, recording dates, and consulting legal references quietly. His strategy was simple: facts over emotion, preparation over confrontation. He would not give her the satisfaction of seeing him react in anger. Days turned into a week, and Karen grew more insistent. She tried to pressure inspectors to make judgments quickly. She confronted delivery drivers, tried to intimidate farmhands, and even suggested that the farmer was reckless and careless. Each time, he responded with calm explanations, presenting his evidence where necessary, never rising to her level of aggression. It was exhausting, but the farmer knew the key was patience. Karen thrived on conflict and public attention, but he had time on his side. The truth was visible in deeds, maps, and local memory. Her attempts to sway opinion were temporary. The land had long-standing evidence backing his ownership. One evening, as twilight painted the field in soft hues of gold, the farmer walked along the rows of corn. He thought about the stakes, the letters, and the public confrontations. He understood the bigger picture now. This was about more than land. It was about standing firm, showing character, and letting the truth unfold in its own time. Karen's tactics were loud, but noise alone could not erase history. He felt a renewed sense of purpose. The cornfield had survived storms, droughts, and pests. It had endured because of careful work and respect. Now it faced human challenges, but the principles were the same: steady hands, careful attention, and patient persistence. He resolved to continue documenting every encounter, every note, and every photograph. If the situation escalated further, he would be ready by the end of the second week. The pressure had not eased, but the farmer had regained a measure of confidence. Karen's public displays of authority were empty in the face of verifiable records. The more she tried to assert dominance, the more the farmer prepared quietly and methodically, letting the evidence do the talking at night. When the fields were quiet again, he sat on the porch, looking out at the corn swaying gently in the wind. The stakes still stood stubbornly at the edges, but they no longer felt threatening. They were reminders, yes, but also markers of the challenge he was overcoming. The story was far from over, but for the first time in days, he felt a sense of control returning. The first battle had been public and tense. The next one would require strategy, careful observation, and patience. He knew the stakes both figuratively and literally, and he was ready. Karen had pressed hard, but the cornfield had its defender, calm and resolute. Ready to flip the script when the time was right, the tension in the small town had grown thick. The farmer could feel it in the way neighbors looked at him when he drove past, the quiet murmurs when he walked to the store, once the curious glances whenever he stepped out into his cornfield. Karen had not relented. Her confidence, which had seemed unshakable at first, only grew with each day, as though the stakes themselves had grown taller and louder in the sunlight. But the farmer had made up his mind. He would not be intimidated. He had already begun the careful work of gathering facts. But now he needed to dig deeper. He started by visiting the county recorder's office early one morning. The air inside smelled of old paper and dust, a smell he had always found comforting, the scent of history, of records that lasted longer than any person could remember. He sat at a worn wooden table and began pulling maps, deeds, and surveys. Each one told a story, sometimes conflicting, sometimes confirming, but always rooted in fact. He scanned lines, checked boundaries, and compared each one to the stakes Karen had planted. The results were already starting to show discrepancies. It was not easy work. Some records were decades old, written in ink that had faded, with hand-drawn lines that had shifted over time. He spent hours tracing the shapes, measuring distances, and cross-referencing them with modern maps. But slowly, clarity emerged. The edges of the cornfield, the rows that had been his responsibility for years, were correctly documented. Karen's claims did not match the official records. The more he compared, the more certain he became. This was not a misunderstanding. It was an attempt to seize something that was not hers. After leaving the office, he walked the perimeter of his field with renewed focus. The stakes glinted in the late afternoon sun, bright orange against the green corn. He took photographs, documenting angles, distances, and alignment with older landmarks that still existed. Every marker, every row, every edge was recorded. His notebook grew heavy with sketches and notes. He knew that careful documentation would speak louder than words in any dispute. That evening, he reached out to longtime residents who had known the property for decades. One by one, they shared memories of past owners, old fences, and stories of planting seasons long before Karen had arrived. Some produced faded photographs showing the field in various stages over the years. A few even had copies of older deeds and surveys that confirmed the farmer's understanding. With each new piece of evidence, he felt more confident, more grounded in the truth. The land had a story, and he was uncovering it. Karen, of course, did not sit idle. Her presence became more pronounced, more theatrical. She brought people to the field, holding conversations loudly enough to be heard across the rows of corn. She claimed she had inspectors lined up, letters sent, and legal action ready to enforce her supposed ownership. It was exhausting to witness. She thrived on public attention, believing that visibility equaled victory. But the farmer had learned to step back, to observe rather than react. The following week, he hired a professional surveyor of his own. Unlike the one Karen brought, this surveyor spent time carefully checking historical records, comparing them to the current landscape, and using precise measurements. The process was painstaking, walking the field inch by inch, checking angles, and confirming boundary lines. He accompanied the surveyor, providing historical context, old markers, and past deeds. The surveyor's reports began to paint a clear picture. The stakes Karen had planted were not aligned with the official boundaries. The farmer's land was intact, and her claims were unfounded. Encouraged, but cautious, the farmer decided to confront the situation methodically. He began preparing a detailed report, gathering every piece of evidence he had collected: photographs, survey results, old maps, and accounts from longtime residents. The report was organized carefully, each section addressing specific points of Karen's claims, each fact backed by records or witness accounts. It was not a document to be waved around in anger, but a tool of truth. It's precise and undeniable. Meanwhile, Karen continued to escalate. She left notes on his gate, called the county office repeatedly, and made loud claims to anyone who would listen. Her friends and supporters sometimes questioned the farmer's right to continue farming, suggesting he might be acting illegally. Supplies were delayed as vendors hesitated, unsure of whose claim to believe. It was a subtle form of pressure, a way to test, resolve, and erode confidence. Yet the farmer stayed focused. He knew that patience and thoroughness would win over impulsive tactics and loud claims. One day, while walking along the edge of the field, he noticed fresh tire tracks near the stakes. The soil was disturbed, and a few young corn plants had been damaged. He photographed everything immediately, knowing that documentation was crucial. Whoever had driven through the field might not have realized it. Their actions could reinforce Karen's narrative if left unrecorded. By capturing the evidence, he took control of the story once again. The farmer also began making phone calls to legal advisors, not to threaten or argue, but to understand the correct procedures and the rights he held. He asked about historical property laws, survey disputes, and proper documentation for boundary disagreements. He made notes on every conversation, preparing himself for any potential escalation. This was not about confrontation. It was about preparation. Knowledge was his ally, and he intended to wield it carefully. As the days passed, his confidence grew alongside the evidence he collected. The boundaries of his field, once threatened by loud claims and orange stakes, were now confirmed by history, surveys, and community memory. Karen's tactics, while aggressive, had no foundation in fact. The more she tried to pressure him, the stronger his position became. His calm, methodical approach contrasted sharply with her impulsive escalation, and he knew it only a matter of time before the truth would prevail. One afternoon, a small group of curious neighbors approached the field. They asked questions, some cautiously, some openly skeptical of Karen's claims. The farmer presented his findings in plain, simple terms, showing old maps, photographs, and survey results. The clarity of his explanation began to sway opinions. People who had been unsure now saw the situation for what it was. The cornfield had always belonged to him. It was a small victory, but an important one. Public perception, once manipulated by loud claims, was beginning to shift toward reality. Karen, noticing the change, grew frustrated. Her previous confidence faltered slightly as more people began to question her story. She tried to double down, bringing more visitors, more claims, and more pressure, but the farmer remained steady. He did not need to shout or intimidate. Facts were on his side, and the truth had a quiet, persistent power that could not be ignored. By the end of the third week, the farmer felt a sense of calm determination. The initial chaos and intimidation had not broken him. Instead, it had reinforced the importance of preparation, evidence, and patience. He continued to document, to survey, and to speak with those who had historical knowledge. Each day, the story of the cornfield grew clearer, and the weight of Karen's claims began to lose its power. Standing at the edge of his field one evening, he looked out over the tall, swaying corn, feeling the rhythm of life that had persisted through countless seasons. The stakes, once symbols of threat, now seemed small and insignificant against the strength of truth. He understood that the battle was far from over, but he also knew that preparation, calmness, and patience were stronger than any loud claim or momentary pressure. Karen had tried to assert dominance, to intimidate and manipulate, but the farmer had found his footing. He had discovered allies in the past, verified records, and undeniable evidence. The field was more than just land. It was history, labor, and integrity. He had begun flipping the script, not with anger or force, but with patience and knowledge. The fight for the cornfield was no longer a test of who shouted the loudest. It had become a test of truth against pretense. And truth was slowly winning. The following week brought a sense of purpose to the farmer that he hadn't felt since the conflict began. The evidence he had collected over the past weeks, the old deeds, survey reports, photographs, and witness accounts, formed a clear story. Each piece was a thread in the fabric of truth, and he now had enough to begin turning the situation around. Karen, confident and loud as ever, had not expected the quiet persistence and methodical approach he had employed. She assumed that volume and spectacle would intimidate him. But what she hadn't considered was patience backed by undeniable proof. It started quietly. The farmer scheduled a meeting with the county office to present his findings formally. He arrived early, carrying neatly organized folders containing every document, every photograph, every note that could prove the boundaries of his land. The clerk at the office looked up, recognizing the farmer from previous visits, and gave a polite nod. There was no fanfare, no drama, just careful preparation. He laid out the evidence, step by step. First, the historical deeds showing ownership and boundaries. Then the surveyor's recent report confirming the placement of markers and corners. He included photographs of the stakes Karen had planted, clearly misaligned with the official lines. Finally, he submitted witness statements from longtime residents who remembered previous owners and the history of the field. The office clerk took each item seriously, noting the attention to detail and the thoroughness of the records. The farmer spoke calmly, explaining each point, answering questions clearly without agitation or insult. Word began to spread quietly. Neighbors who had watched the conflict unfold now started to realize that the story they had been hearing was incomplete. Some of Karen's supporters came forward with doubts, asking questions about the discrepancies in her claims. The farmer's careful documentation made it difficult to dismiss the facts. People began to see that truth required more than loud assertions. It required evidence, consistency, and history. Meanwhile, Karen escalated in other ways. She tried to hold meetings with neighbors, pointing to her own documents, claiming authority, and even suggesting that the farmer was trying to manipulate the facts. Her efforts, however, began to backfire. As more people examined the situation, her misalignment with the actual boundaries became clear. Her statements, once commanding and intimidating, now seemed less convincing. She realized that her strategy relied on the assumption that others would not question her. But that assumption was proving false. The farmer took advantage of this shift carefully. He invited neutral observers, including a respected surveyor and a couple of older neighbors, to visit the field. Together, they walked the boundaries, measured distances, and compared them with historical markers. The results were undeniable. Karen's stakes did not correspond to the legal property lines, and the field had always been in the farmer's care. He recorded everything meticulously, photographing each step, so there would be no room for doubt or misinterpretation. Karen noticed the change in momentum and grew frustrated. Her tone became sharper, her presence more insistent, but it no longer had the same effect. The neighbors who had previously whispered doubts now asked pointed questions. Comparing her claims with the evidence on display, the farmer maintained his calm demeanor, never raising his voice, letting the facts speak for themselves. Every demonstration of patience and preparation further undermined her aggressive approach. One afternoon, a local official visited the field. They walked alongside the farmer, examining the boundaries, comparing his records with historical documents, and inspecting the surveyor's measurements. Karen arrived midway, attempting to assert control, but her claims were quickly corrected by the official's neutral observations. She protested, but the authority of documented evidence and professional surveying outweighed her words. It was the first time she truly understood that spectacle alone could not claim land that was legally and historically verified. Encouraged by the progress, the farmer decided to make a public presentation. He invited neighbors and community members to the field, not to shame or embarrass anyone, but to provide clarity. He laid out the documents on a simple folding table, walked attendees along the rows of corn, showed the stakes and the boundaries, and explained the surveyor's report. He even shared photographs of the orange stakes she had planted and contrasted them with the legal markers. His calm, factual presentation allowed people to understand the situation without conflict or confrontation. By the end of the gathering, many who had previously believed Karen's claims were convinced that the field had always belonged to the farmer. Karen attempted to interrupt, but her voice was drowned out by the clarity of the evidence and the understanding of the community. Some neighbors asked questions politely, and she found herself unable to answer them convincingly. Her confidence, once so commanding, began to waver. The contrast between her impulsive, loud behavior and the farmer's measured, fact-based approach was now visible to everyone. From that point on, the farmer continued to document every interaction. Each visit from Karen, each letter, each claim was recorded, logged, and analyzed. He was not acting out of fear or revenge, but from a need to protect his property and ensure that the truth was clear. His actions were consistent, logical, and transparent. He let the evidence accumulate while Karen's bluster lost its impact. Within days, county office responded to his filings. They verified the boundaries officially, confirming that the field remained under the farmer's ownership. Notices were sent to Karen, clearly outlining the legal lines and confirming that her claims were unfounded. The official response provided the clarity the community needed, reinforcing what the farmer had already proven through careful documentation and public presentation. Karen's strategy began to crumble further. Her previous attempts to intimidate and manipulate the narrative had been countered by evidence, history, and clear documentation. Her friends and supporters began to withdraw as the facts became impossible to ignore. The farmer, however, remained composed. He did not celebrate loudly or publicly humiliate her. He understood that calm integrity often spoke louder than victory speeches. The cornfield itself became a symbol of resilience. The rows swayed gently in the wind, as if acknowledging the farmer's dedication. Every step he took along the field, every document he presented, and every neighbor he consulted reinforced the legitimacy of his work. Karen had tried to assert control through noise and pressure, but he had flipped the script with patience, preparation, and unwavering focus on the truth. By the end of the 4th week, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The community recognized the farmer's commitment to fairness, accuracy, and integrity. Karen, once commanding and intimidating, now seemed isolated, her influence waning. The stakes she had planted were still visible in the field, but they no longer carried weight. They were reminders of her failed attempts and the power of calm persistence. Standing at the edge of his cornfield one evening, the farmer watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the rows he had tended for so many years. He reflected on the journey, the initial shock, the pressure, the careful gathering of evidence, and the slow, steady flip of the script. He had not needed to fight with anger or aggression. Instead, he had relied on patience, facts, and community support. The land remained his, untouched and secure. And the story of its defense had become a lesson in integrity, perseverance, and the quiet strength of truth. By the beginning of the 5th week, the tension that had once loomed over the cornfield had begun to fade. The farmer had presented his evidence, worked with surveyors and longtime residents, and allowed the facts to speak louder than any argument or threat. Karen's attempts to assert control had failed, and the community now understood where the truth lay. Yet, the farmer knew that final resolution required patience, careful attention, and a steady hand. It started quietly, as it often did in the town. Karen continued to drive by the field, but the energy that once accompanied her presence, the confidence, the noise, the spectacle, had diminished. She no longer had an audience ready to echo her claims because the community had seen the evidence. Conversations that once questioned the farmer's actions were now focused on the misalignment between her claims and the verified boundaries. Her narrative was unraveling. There was little she could do to stop it. The farmer took this opportunity to secure the field definitively. He coordinated with the county office to ensure that the official records reflected the surveyor's measurements and the historical deeds. Each corner, each boundary, and each edge was documented formally, leaving no room for dispute. Notices were sent to Karen, making it clear that her claims were invalid and that the field remained under the farmer's ownership. This was not a victory born of confrontation, but one cemented by clarity and procedure. Even with the official confirmation, the farmer continued to work the field meticulously. Each row of corn received careful attention. Irrigation lines were checked, pests controlled, and soil treated with the same diligence as before. The work itself became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that the field had not been threatened by noise or intimidation, only by preparation and persistence. Neighbors began to approach him differently as well. Where uncertainty or doubt had once existed, there was now respect and admiration. People who had watched Karen's attempts with curiosity now saw the farmer as someone who had handled the situation with calm, intelligence, and patience. Some came to ask about the process, how to protect their own land or approach similar conflicts. He shared his experiences humbly, emphasizing the importance of preparation, documentation, and reliance on facts rather than emotion. Karen, observing from a distance, began to retreat. She made fewer visits, spoke to fewer people, and her confidence visibly waned. The farmer did not gloat or confront her. He understood that the resolution had come not through victory over a person, but through the strength of truth and integrity. The stakes she had planted were still in the field, but they were meaningless markers of her failed attempt, reminders of a strategy that had not succeeded. One day, the farmer decided to hold a small gathering for the community. He invited neighbors, surveyors, and those who had supported the documentation process. The gathering was simple: a walk through the cornfield, a presentation of the verified boundaries, and an open conversation about property rights and evidence. The atmosphere was calm, not celebratory, but there was a sense of closure in the air. People could see the work he had done, the care with which he had approached the situation, and the peaceful resolution that had been achieved. During the gathering, Karen appeared briefly, attempting to speak, but she was met with polite yet firm acknowledgement of the official records and the surveyor's report. Her influence had diminished to the point where her words held little weight. The farmer did not argue. He simply allowed the truth to stand on its own. By the end of the meeting, she left quietly, no longer commanding attention or attempting to assert authority. With Karen's retreat, farmer's focus returned entirely to the cornfield. The work of planting, tending, and harvesting regained its rhythm. The days of uncertainty, tension, and dispute were replaced with routine and purpose. Every row of corn became a symbol of resilience and continuity, proof that careful work and steadfast integrity could withstand attempts at disruption. The community also learned from the experience. They saw that conflicts over land, boundaries, or claims could be resolved through documentation, patience, and reliance on facts. The story of the cornfield became a quiet lesson in persistence and truth. It demonstrated that intimidation and noise might create temporary pressure, but they could not replace preparation, honesty, and methodical effort. The farmer also took time to reflect personally. He realized that the challenge had tested more than just his knowledge of property boundaries. It had tested his patience, his ability to remain calm under pressure, and his commitment to integrity. Each day spent documenting, surveying, and consulting with neighbors strengthened not just his position on the land, but his confidence in dealing with conflict in general. He understood that true power came not from confrontation, but from preparation and consistency. As harvest time approached, the cornfield stood tall and healthy. The rows were full, the stalks green and vibrant, and the promise of a successful season hung in the air. The farmer walked the field at dawn one morning, feeling the soft breeze and listening to the quiet rustle of leaves. He knew that the field, once threatened by misunderstanding and bold claims, was now secure. Every step along the rows reminded him of the journey of tension, patience, and ultimate resolution. By the end of the 5th week, the farmer had not only secured the land but also restored peace. Karen's attempts to take control had failed. The community's perception had shifted fully toward understanding the truth. The cornfield remained intact, a testament to careful work, integrity, and the quiet strength of standing firm without aggression. Looking back, the farmer saw the conflict as a lesson in resilience. The field had survived storms, droughts, and pests, and now it had survived human challenges as well. The story of Karen's attempts, the stakes she planted, and the calm persistence that overcame them became part of the community's collective memory. It was a reminder that preparation, patience, and evidence could turn even the most aggressive challenges into stories of victory and integrity. The cornfield, once under threat, now thrived. The sun rose and set over the tall stalks, casting golden light across the rows. The farmer moved through the field with purpose, tending to every plant, every inch of soil, knowing that the land was secure and that his work and integrity had been vindicated. In the quiet rhythm of planting, growing, and harvesting, the story reached its natural conclusion. Truth and persistence had won, and the field, the community, and the farmer all moved forward, stronger and wiser than before.